She wasn't the only one who wanted to seduce the gorgeous-looking pastor, but she was the only one who brought him down. He swore before God that he would worship his faith if he did not move anyone. Pastor Arthur is the son of a wealthy family. At the age of 5, a little girl appeared in front of the boy Arthur. She was beautiful, her hair as red as fire and her face as radiant as an angel. Arthur was so impressed by the memory, he didn't flirt with any other girl until later. Before going to church and asking to serve the Lord, he also had a brief affair and she returned to God before him. Life seemed to be peaceful forever with him, until the little girl with fire-colored hair appeared. She stirred his heart, driving him crazy. She has been a diminutive seamstress working at a tailor shop in the area for 8 years now. One day, she wanted to enter a costume design contest for a famous opera artist named Prima Donna, for a chance to become a designer, but some bad guy sabotaged her suit. And to comfort her disappointment, a colleague named Ben found her a pretty good job, sewing new costumes for priests at the Arzaheim. Heather didn't even agree at first, but considering that the place would pay her quite well, have a place to eat and rest for a while, so she wouldn't have to pay rent anymore, it comforted her quite a bit. And her kind friend Ben helped her register with the church to sew clothes for the upcoming mass. Our Heather was very tired tonight. She had just come home from some wine and was a little drunk. The young girl's languid footsteps on the deserted street were lonely. Be aware that you yourself are beautiful, so don't imitate our Heather wandering the streets at night. Danger lurks around us. Heather heard moans from a small cat in the roadway, which was crying so cold, "Someone help me." Heather leaned down and picked it up, hugging it comfortingly. "Come here, kid, maybe you're just as lonely as I am? Are you going to help me?" "My nose is so cold, help me," the little animal groaned. Heather lifted the small animal up to her face, looked at it for a moment and realized that it wasn't a cat, and it was speaking to her in human language. It was a super cute little elephant she had never seen. Maybe she was drunk, she thought, and no longer questioned the oddity of the creature she was holding in her arms. "Oh, she'll help it right away." Heather kindly took from her handbag some needles and stitches, a piece of fabric from the contest outfit she had vandalized in the morning. Heather, in her drunken form, cleverly sewed a small, very pretty and fitting bag that covered the little elephant's long nose. The baby elephant was quite pleased. He flew up as high as her head, complimenting the bag she made, although not as luxurious as the one he used, but he appreciated her for it. Heather needed to go to bed. She said goodbye to the little elephant and turned to leave. The little elephant asked what her name was, to which she replied that her name was Heather Glean. The little elephant flew towards Heather, saying, "Heather is beautiful and kind, you helped me, and so I will repay you. You will be blessed, rewarded with the reward of being warmly loved by the most beautiful man in this area." Heather, drunk but not to the point of madness, asks if she can exchange that award for the fact that she will become a designer for the most famous opera artist today. And the answer is no. Of course, the little elephant can only help her get love, other wishes cannot. Heather is not too greedy. It is good to have beautiful love with beautiful boys. She is satisfied with the reward that the flying elephant promises. She greeted him, told him to keep the bag over his nose that she had just made for him, and left, muttering in her drunkenness. The next morning, she, along with some seamstresses in the tailor's shop, went to the Arzaheim church to work. It is quite hot outside, but in the stone church it is very cool. With the excellent ventilation structure that people have created, the church can regulate itself at a slightly more comfortable temperature. The person in charge of the church errands, a young priest, came out to greet them. It was Father Bertie. He helped them pack their bags and bedrooms for the few days they worked here to prepare their clothes for Mass. It was quite hot, so Heather decided to take a shower to refresh her body a bit. She walked around looking for a place where she could shower, and found a rather secluded spot, which was probably where she needed to look. Although she had come here once a few years ago, this place she had never entered. Heather had just approached a window and watched, when suddenly a bee rushed forward, full of ferocity, followed by many friends, heading in her direction. Heather screamed, throwing down the clothes in her hands and running as fast as she could, running while calling for help. Running a few meters, she bumped into a person who had just passed by, and they both fell to the ground. More precisely, the person fell to the ground, and Heather fell on top of him. It's a man, ladies and gentlemen, of course, this love story begins in this paragraph. Heather seemed to be instigated by a voice ringing in her ear. She clutched what she caught in her hand. It was something hard and as big as her wrist, and it was under the fabric of the mantle she was pressing on. That thing was hidden under his abdomen. Despite the man's pleading with her to remove her hand from it, Heather was mesmerized by the voice in her ear. She continued to touch the thing, studying it with her hands. The whisper in her head continued to make her think about it. That thing is in such a position that it is. With such a great size, if he spread his legs apart, it would be even better. Heather smiled sheepishly, slowly lifting her head and coming back to her senses. In front of her was the angry face of the priest who was trying to push her away. At that moment, a few people rushed over and watched this interesting scene, a girl hugging the young priest on the ground. Olga, the female reporter, quickly snapped the sharpest possible photo before the pair on the ground could get up. In addition to being a reporter, she was also a close friend of Heather's. Heather furiously explained the incident that had just happened, which was caused by bees suddenly chasing her, causing her to bump into the priest and fall. Of course she was telling the truth, and obviously no one had seen any bees. With the exception of Heather, only she saw that the bees had turned into a mass suspended from the ceiling, and it was gathering into a rather familiar shape. Heather had seen it somewhere, she remembered it. It was the elephant that had appeared drunk last night. He hovered overhead, his face playful and mischievous, saying, "Hello Heather, I've come to return the favor." Heather thought she wasn't very conscious, but in a situation like this, she was quick-witted, running away from the spot, leaving their angry screams mixed with amusement. The young priest suffered because he had just been offended. He was hurt quite badly. But the incident became more damaging when images of the revered priest and a young girl lying on the ground were published in several local newspapers, and the news was quite curious among residents of the area. Heather read the newspaper and crumpled it miserably, muttering angrily at being sold out by her best friend. Heather thought about it. It didn't seem like she was drunk enough to imagine a talking creature. It's real, that flying elephant, and it's all caused by it. The problem was that no one saw it but her. And it was on the table in front of Heather's eyes. "Who are you? And what do you want?" Heather asked calmly. The little elephant smiled friendly, introducing himself as one of the 5 gods that people worship, Cupid. And it's a goddess, whose real name sounds more intimate, Pouring, which sounds like the name of a little pony. Pretty cute, right? He came back and made a promise to bring the most beautiful love to a man for Heather. But what good was that for her other than what she was doing now? Now she had become a pervert in everyone's eyes. Although the reporter's best friend had kept Heather's identity a secret, the priest had seen her and he must have been terrified. Pouring told her the current situation, that he was trying to match her as promised. But the most beautiful man in the area, Arthur, has such a pure and steady heart that his divine power has not yet broken its protective ring to make him fall in love with her. Heather held her head irritated. "It's not good. What are you even releasing the bees for?" Pouring laughed shyly. "It's because my divine power isn't strong enough to create such scenes to stimulate love to grow." Pouring explains why she can't refuse this love, because she is his 10 billionth client, and can't because Arthur has a steadfast heart to break his record. Heather was depressed and could do nothing but leave the god of love with winged promises. The next day, curious people gathered at the church in greater numbers than usual, and Heather initially thought it was a market. They came to admire the beauty of this young priest who had just arrived at the Arzaheim, and see if he was pure. Heather sat in prayer in church, full of anxiety and guilt for what she had done to the priest. She thought she needed to go to the confession room, and before that she needed to find a priest to apologize for this embarrassing incident. She waited in the hallway of the priest's bedroom for a long, long time until she dozed off there. Arthur returned to his room. He walked past her and went inside. When he approached Heather, Arthur bent down, looking at her with pity for a misguided sheep. The sound of footsteps woke Heather up. She ran after him, but quickly closed the door. She had to wait a long time before Arthur opened the door again and exited. He was amazed at the persistence and brazenness of this young woman. What else was she going to do? Heather ran after him, trying to clear herself about what had happened. She said the bees had actually caused her to run away and fall on him. And she said that, "It's pretty hard and long, so while I was stubbing I thought it was a stick." Heather explained of the act of grabbing and not letting go of the foreign object. And that explanation made the priest blush. "Did you come to apologize or to harass me?" Despite her explanation, the priest seriously said that she was not the only girl who wanted to harass him. He advised her to repent of her dark thoughts and then left emphatically. Heather was upset that the Prince of Arzaheim regarded her as an evil pervert, when the god-pouring hovered over her head, whispering in her ear that if there was such strong resistance, wouldn't it be easier to tie him in? This word of the elephant god indeed made Heather laugh. Then a few days passed, and the tailor's work was nearing completion. Ben said that in about 2 days they would leave the church and return to Yevgeny's tailor's shop. Heather was looking for a restaurant down the street for dinner. She had been so busy working that she forgot her mealtime and now she was hungry. Moments later, with her stomach full, Heather returned to church to shower and sleep. She followed a small corridor, which was a shortcut she had found for herself. Heather walked up the deserted stairs. Suddenly a gentle scent entered her nose. It was a chamomile scent. Heather looked up to look. In the faint moonlight, the figure of Pastor Ather appeared. He was stepping down very close to her. Ather's eyes were full of sadness, suddenly lighting up a little when he recognized Heather. He coldly asked if she had followed him, to which Heather replied that she had only gone out to dinner, despite knowing that he didn't believe her words. He said she turned her back from looking directly at him and walked past her on the narrow stone staircase. But such a great opportunity pouring cannot be missed. He suddenly appeared and flew around their heads, deliberately rushing towards the Pastor Ather. Heather cried out, "Pouring, stop," and rushed to pounce on the little elephant that was flying like a fly around the priest. With all her might, Heather managed to pounce on it, she thought. But no, she grabbed the pastor's shirt. Heather lost her balance and nearly fell down the stairs, but a hand managed to grab her waist. Heather sighed and quickly said, "Thank you." But she raised her hand holding something soft in her hand, which looked like a piece of dark cloth, a piece of the priest's garment. The long cloak ripped off, somehow it tore all and fell as if it had just been cut apart with scissors. Ather's chest was uncovered, revealing a strong body close to Heather's that confused them both. Heather smiled shyly and said it was okay not to wear it. It was quite hot today, filled with fear at the angry gaze of the pastor. Heather tried to put the cloth back on her torn spot, and he jerked back. In an attempt to salvage the situation in the end, Heather was unable to make it heal. She said he should return to church before morning. She was so embarrassed that she forgot to apologize to him. Ather was too upset to say anything more, sitting down the stairs, his hands crumpling his thick, dark hair in disarray. Heather felt guilty for looking at him like that. She tried to comfort him that she hadn't seen anything earlier. Ather said sarcastically, "You're lying, thought I didn't see your eyes move?" Heather said, "Oh yes, I've seen it all, 8-pack abs, navel, thighs, long legs, collarbones, big pectoral muscles, great." This sentence wasn't invented by her, it just came from her mouth. The god of love was smiling mischievously next to her head, which made her say that. Heather was desperate for her shocking apology. This pure priest was actually stunned by her last words. He looked pitiful. Suddenly a complicated situation took place. While they were arguing about whether the shirt had been torn accidentally or intentionally, several men walked up nearby. Heather realized they were her friends, and one of them was gay. It was Miller's birthday. He had been drinking quite a bit, and if the pastor was out there in this state, he would really be tainted and ridiculed. Heather took his hand, familiarly, pulling him into a dark corner, which was narrower than she thought. But having run in here and having no choice, they stood chatting near where Heather and Ather were standing. To stop Heather from crying out, Ather covered her mouth with his hand. They were standing in a position where it was difficult to control their thoughts. Heather's hand was trying to push Ather away a bit, but it was resting on his stomach, where there was no cover. They grumbled about the enemy not standing further away, but it was actually a narrow gap at the foot of the stairs, and they needed patience before the drunks left. I was wearing quite a bit of fabric and touched her thighs to Heather's waist. The part between his legs was heating up in the summer weather and the space was tight. He reproachfully lamented in despair. He was no longer in control of the situation and his body, something that had never happened to him. Heather was frightened and didn't know how. She couldn't ruin the honor of this church's most famous priest. She nestled silently against Arthur's chest and waited together for the others to leave. But the conversation of 3 people and 3 bottles of wine has just begun. They have chosen a beautiful spot to sit and chat and watch the moon. For a moment, Heather's body began to get wet from the heat, sweat sticking her shirt together. Breathing is getting hotter and quicker. Arthur groaned, "Can you please breathe lighter? You make me so uncomfortable." Heather exasperated, taking a sharp breath into his neck and face. "You can breathe less too. Isn't a pious person so good at bearing?" Heather grumbled. Arthur couldn't really elaborate on her request. "She breathed into my chest, which made me very uncomfortable." She pushed him back with her hands, but couldn't. Heather snapped and wiggled constantly to find the most comfortable standing position possible. Arthur begged her to stop moving like that constantly. "It's crazy." The pastor was genuinely insane. Heather was also irritated by the crampedness, saying she needed to find a foothold, avoid something that was getting entangled in her thigh. She reached down and touched it to check. Under the fabric of his rather thin trousers, a hard object was found by Heather. She took it and said it was this stick that got her entangled in the abdomen. Arthur was silent for a moment, his teeth clenched and his face heated up like a fever. "Take your hands off, it's not a stick." Heather asked again, "Wouldn't it be a python?" She joked, and soon stopped laughing when she heard Arthur's very small words, "of my quarters." The pure and innocent Heather, who had never been in love before, suddenly felt angry. "Pastor, how can you be perverted in such a situation?" Arthur lamented, "I told you not to breathe into my chest. I can't control my emotions every time you're around me." "Bring it down," she ordered, but Arthur couldn't control his brother. Heather came up with an idea and she did it right away. She slipped her hand inside the last of his fabric, grabbing his little friend, in her desperate silence. "I'll rub it to help you lower it." Heather had never been in love, but she knew quite a few intricacies of growing up. The tailor's dexterous hand was constantly moving, and it only took a few seconds to freeze the entire resistance of Arthur. Suddenly he put a hand behind the back of her neck, pulled her even closer, leaned down to put his ear in her mouth and whispered, "Say, your voice is destroying me." Heather closed her eyes in silence, now that she understood why he had told her to breathe lightly. She held his face tightly, comforting him. "You can stand still, I will help you free yourself from this discomfort." Her hands were faster, her breathing became faster from fatigue, and in a few short minutes, Arthur's breathing became more urgent than hers. Heather's hands were suddenly wet and sticky, and in the darkness, a faint dark smell wafted from below. Arthur and Heather fell silent again, just as the drunks left. It was almost morning, and some workers got up to start their working day early. To let them see a tatteredly dressed pastor walking outside the church would be a great insult to God. The torn piece of clothing on Arthur's body had been used earlier to wipe Heather's hands. He was not wearing a shirt. The clever Heather devised a clever way to hide the pastor from the public eye. She put him in a large trash can and pushed him back to church. The door to Arthur's room was always unlocked, and Heather pushed the trash can all the way into the room, telling him he was going here, and then he could safely go out to shower. After a long, tiring night, Arthur went to bed and lay down for a nap. In his dreams, he still dreamed of that magical red hair. Her holy eyes, beautiful face and clear voice tormented him again in dreams of childhood. She held hands with young Arthur, a small young master from the prestigious Rinver family in the area. A festival called Ajafata, a carnival in the area, is also the young master's birthday. He watched his parents and servants in the house cut birthday cakes and peel gifts from other noble families sent to him. After getting dressed and putting on a mask, the shy and bored Arthur ran away from the nanny, hid around a street corner and planned to hang out alone. Suddenly a slender hand grabbed his hand and pulled away, his red hair and gentle voice leading him away. Arthur had some very fun moments and will never forget the little girl wearing that mask. Arthur had met her again. It was Heather, the seamstress who had driven him crazy for days. Arthur sat up, remembering Heather's voice, remembering when she grabbed his little friend and whispered, "You hurry up." Suddenly, the robe he wore became soaked. Arthur once again lost his temper. He was upset and wondered why, so far, any seductive behavior by both women and even men towards him made him feel as disgusted as looking at a bunch of stray dogs. And not when standing next to Heather. He stood before the cross and prayed to repent of the dirty thoughts that had just arisen in his heart. He committed a grave sin as a priest. Arthur trembled in repentance before the Lord, asking him to wash away the thoughts of lust and lust in his heart, which God had given him to be pure all this time. Arthur walked out of the chapel and met Bertie standing there. He approached and put his hand on Bertie's shoulder, earnestly pleading with him for help to get rid of temptations. Bertie was surprised by this. With the kindness God has given to priests, Bertie is more than willing to help him. During a simple lunch, Bertie is quite surprised to learn that the lust that Arthur cannot control and abolish comes from a seamstress. Arthur described it as a beauty with charming red hair, but Bertie doesn't remember that someone particularly stood out among the seamstresses. Contrary to Bertie's expectations of a beautiful and charming woman, Heather is small and looks rather goofy. The two priests calmly observed Bertie dozing in the prayer room. While Bertie judged her uglier than the girl who sent gifts to Arthur last week, Arthur candidly shared her views on beauty. Those plump lips and pretty plump face were attractive to him. So much so that he had to stop looking at her, or else he would continue to be stunned and mad. Arthur closed her eyes and prayed. But even at God's feet, the little elephant god did not spare him. A piece of paper was thrown at Arthur's shoulder. It was written by Heather under the commanding power of pouring. It reads as follows: "The lip color is the same as the nipple color, but your lips look a little redder. I want to lick it. I wanted to sit on your face. Just thinking about it, it's already wet. Lick it clean." Arthur picked up all the pieces of paper that Heather threw at him. He read them line by line, full of filth but excitement. He couldn't let anyone pick up and read such inscriptions. Arthur seemed to go mad, praying to God to cleanse him of the images he had just imagined. Innocent Heather had no idea about it. She was actually dozing off without knowing that she had committed a major crime, killing tens of thousands of innocent little warriors. At this time, the priests were trying on freshly sewn clothes. Heather stood near Arthur and reviewed the clothes she had made for them. Bertie stood by and took a closer look at the behavior of the girl Arthur feared. A lot of incidents happened while Heather was standing near the Arthur. A ball of children playing in the churchyard flew at Heather and knocked her over. Arthur, something under their feet suddenly caused Heather and Arthur to both fall to the ground. He thought of the moment his shirt had torn the night before and felt scared, telling her to stay away from him for a bit. Bertie wondered how she could do such things to such a pure priest. Was she a witch? Arthur did not intend to report the trouble Heather had caused to the church. Another day passed, another night he had to wash his blankets after waking up, all because that red hair made him feel hot and tense, even in her dreams. Arthur sat up and crumpled her dark brown hair sadly. The church needed to sew a new series of vestments, and the designs sent by Yevgeny tailors would help priests choose gowns for the upcoming feast day. Heather showed Arthur and several priests their drawings. Heather knew she had been causing quite a bit of trouble to the priest over the past few days. She knew that whenever she was near him, pouring would cause them trouble. She bent down to avoid her scrutinizing gaze, intently drawing the customary garments from the church before sewing them. But within minutes, Heather was starting to daydream again, her feet poking out under the table, towards Arthur and teasing. Her toes touched between his legs, grabbing it and rubbing it lightly, while her eyes were still closed. Arthur watched the girl for a few seconds, feeling extremely humiliated, angrily grabbed Heather's hand and dragged her out to the surprise of those in the room at the time. Heather came to her senses, bewildered by the priest's angry attitude. He questioned her about why she was bothering him. From the notes she had sent him obscenities. Heather of course said she didn't know about it. She explained about the flying elephant that only she saw, but Arthur couldn't believe anything like that. He was tired of hearing her explain, almost screaming, "I daydream every night and can't quench the desires you plant in my mind. You couldn't understand the feeling of an erection throughout the day. I think about what you've done to me all the time." Heather was stunned to hear this. Her face had both a shy and merciful expression. He must have struggled to balance his mood for the past time. Those who had just run out to follow them were also shocked by the priest's words. Arthur and Heather went out into the garden together and returned to their own rooms, where they shared the road for a while. Heather walked a few feet behind Arthur. She didn't dare say anything more to him. But Pouring didn't leave them alone. She whispered in Heather's ear again and quickly turned into a small cup, flying towards him, hitting him by surprise and falling to the ground. Arthur no longer had the strength to be angry with Heather. He muttered, "It's you, isn't it, Miss Taylor?" A frightened Heather ran to pick her up. He was holding his hands under his position between the legs, his face contorted with pain. She touched Arthur's hand with her hand to examine the wound, clarifying that she hadn't caused it. Arthur said she should take a sincere attitude to apologize, and not touch people physically. Heather, frustrated and quite annoyed, she exclaimed, "Isn't it because I'm always nervous around you?" explaining that she was really worried about causing something to the priest. She didn't want to, it was all about the elephant. Arthur stood up and walked onto his room. The road from the chapel to the priest's resting place was a short distance away, and thank goodness Pouring was making a little rainfall wet them. The mischievous eyes of the god of love made Heather uneasy about the Arthur. She hurriedly ran after him. It would be better to go together. They entered a nearby room together. The rain was probably a long time away, and they needed heat. Arthur lit the fireplace, while Heather pulled out a bottle of wine from the kitchen table. This room was originally Arthur's living room. As for the bottle, it's unclear where it came from. Heather poured 2 glasses of wine, offered him, with the sincerest apology, but Arthur refused. He did not drink alcohol, because it made the soul no longer pure. Heather asked him to live a life without friends, without lust and joy. What do you do for relief when he encounters trouble? Heather asked him in surprise. Why was she 5 years younger than her, but had the soul of an 80-year-old man? Heather invited him to sit beside her with the assurance that she would do nothing to harm him. Arthur sat down, watching the girl who was 5 years older than him. Compared to the age difference, she really looked too young and beautiful. He advised her to stop drinking. Her face was already red. But Heather said she drank so little she couldn't get drunk, or if she was drunk and did something unusual, he should control her actions. She laughed and said his biceps were as big as her thighs. There was no reason to fear her. But Arthur didn't think about it. He was staring at the drop of wine sticking to her lips, brushed it away with his hand slightly, slowly saying, "I don't intend to use force against you, nor will I later." Heather asks him if he knows why she came to this church, and Arthur tries to reply that she intends to seduce him, but he doesn't continue. Heather tells him about her disappointment when her dream of being a designer is ruined. Her sad smile as she told her story caught Arthur's attention. She wasn't the kind of person he thought. Heather asked him why he was serving the church, and Arthur said it was an oath to his ex-girlfriend, whom God had called before him. The day he met her on the stairs was the day of her death. Heather looked at him. She thought he was pitiful, then she shouldn't continue to disturb his practice. According to the contract with Pouring, love with the most beautiful boy in the region and with enough mental strength not to be matched by the god of love, will need to end soon. Pouring and Heather's daring plan was to break into Arthur's room while he was asleep. With his divine power, Pouring makes him sleep a little more, which makes it easier for Heather to carry out the plan. Dressed as a professional crook, Heather crept into the priest's tidy room. He was sleeping soundly and was very intoxicated because he had been hit by the god's magic. Heather crept open his blanket, a tall body sleeping peacefully, as beautiful as a data statue. Heather looked at him intently, apologized in his ear, and quickly got to work. The clothes on Arthur's body had been completely removed. To Heather's, crept in fear. The little elephant complimented the boy's body before disappearing. At least she was quite delicate. Only Heather and she had to find a way to get the baseball bat away to hide in her belly. But it wasn't very straight. Heather lifted it with her hand, it was still fast asleep. Heather remembered the last time Arthur had spoken very sensitively to her voice. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "Arthur, do you want to be attacked by me?" Up. Keep going, yes. Come on, it's delicious, yes. The words she had learned were indeed very useful. The little fellow had awakened, full of life. As she had learned, Heather sat on it, tried to put it between her legs, pressed it down, her mouth muttering, "Sorry, Arthur, I really didn't mean to." Her face was red from exertion, pain, and embarrassment. Her hand held it, trying to press inside, but to no avail. It was too big for her to put herself inside. The feeling of pain from the bottom of her belly passed upwards, but Heather felt another strange and alluring sensation that she couldn't stop. Just a little more to put it inside, she told herself. She fiddled for a moment and paused to rest. Suddenly there was a vibration coming from below. The sensation shook her whole body, but Heather couldn't cry out, she couldn't wake him up. Arthur was still closing his eyes, but his hands were holding Heather's hips, and his hips began to move up and down. She was both frightened and amused by the movement from his side. For a moment she couldn't keep quiet but cried out loud and woke Arthur up. He widened his eyes and looked at the current situation, wondering what had he done? Then he asked her what she was doing. Heather held her head in shame, the madness was revealed. But this needs to be done, to free the flying elephant. Until her love ends beautifully, her god of love will leave. Arthur hugged his face and crumpled his hair, trembling with anger. But he couldn't stop either. She made a small suggestion, as her legs still gripped the baseball bat she had just captured. "Can you help me get it in and out 10 more times, then I won't bother you anymore." Heather leaned down close to Arthur's face and pleaded. She made Arthur break the stamina he could. He angrily held onto her, pinning her down on her stomach. In an overwhelming stance, Arthur began to slowly attack her from behind. 1, 2, 3. There had been more than 10 inserts and takeouts. Arthur leaned down, snarling his voice into the silent Heather ear below. "How dare you steal my virginity while I'm sleeping? Stop this dirty act." Heather bit her hand to stop the sound from escaping from her mouth, softly saying, "The one who isn't stopping is you. It's been more than 10 times. Arthur said miserably, "I can't stop." He groaned, "It's so tight, I seem to be about to break off." Arthur held her face tightly, forcing her to open her eyes to see him performing his punishment. By the second outburst, Heather was tired, she fell asleep without knowing it. Arthur lay beside her, gently stroking the soft fiery red hair in his hand, whispering in her ear, "Heather, no, I haven't feel enough." He stared intently at her face, leaning down close to her lips, intending to place a kiss on it. But suddenly coming to his senses, he walked into the bathroom, filling the tub with a little perfume oil. Cleansing the body with warm water will help him recover and purify. But as soon as he got back to bed, Arthur didn't see her. He hadn't even kissed her yet, Arthur muttered. It was truly his first time, and he couldn't contain the joy that was rising in his heart. Meanwhile, Heather had returned to her room as soon as she woke up. She breathed a sigh of relief. Surely the god of love was done, and from now on she would not be bothered by it anymore. Normal life would return to her, and Heather would just finish her church work and return to the tailor's shop. For 10 days now she had avoided him. She just stayed in her sewing area, finishing the final stages. However, she lacks concentration and is often reminded by Ben for minor mistakes. With only 2 days left before they were leaving, she suddenly thought about how he was doing, and then after not seeing him again, can they meet again? Recent days have been unsettled with Arthur. Arthur joined Sir Bertie for lunch. He asked Arthur about the current situation, if he was psychologically more stable. Arthur was a little unstable. During ADH's psychological counseling, Bertan realizes that it is Arthur who is a bit perverted. He often has questions like, "Won't she like me anymore? Look, she's been acting awkward, to try to seduce me," though Bertie saw that Heather was sleepy and didn't show any earnestness. Arthur is quite zealous and annoyed by Heather's indifference. Bertie finds extreme anxiety when he asks Arthur what is it about Heather that makes Arthur uncomfortable now. to which Arthur replies that she's cute. Indeed, lust, once aroused, would be difficult to extinguish, and that fire still smoldered in the young priest's strong body. At this point Ben said she would attend the priest's new enclosure ceremony the next day. Heather was about to turn it down for someone else to do, but thinking that it would be the last time she would see her again, Heather nodded. During the ceremony of distributing new robes to the new priests, he wore a beautiful, dignified shirt standing on an elevated platform. Behind him, Taylor Glean watched intently, wondering if he had gotten over the previous day's shock. Suddenly, she saw a rather long extra thread on the priest's collar. Arthur. For the photo containing the tangled thread to appear on a newspaper page, the store's reputation would suffer, and she would be deducted from her salary. Heather crept up holding a small pair of scissors standing behind her, reaching up to cut the extra thread. Because he was too tall, she had to reach up to cut off the tangled thread. But by the power of the author of this story, and Mr. Poring loves matchmaking, the Gobi shirt is torn, the whole thing. Arthur's whole body was naked in front of the camera. It was really a big breakdown. Arthur hugged his torso in fear. When he turned to look at Heather, he saw that she was terribly frightened. Her face was about to cry, furrowed, not looking like a deliberate troublemaker. The pouring elephant hovered and provocatively overhead, intending to knock him over. Heather didn't have time to consider. She rushed over to hug him, shielding him from the camera with her body. They quickly found a cloth beside them and put them on, and the ceremony went quickly. And the next day, the image of Arthur appeared as a newspaper scoop. Heather thought sadly about the trouble this time. She didn't see Arthur again. Poring shows up, so the matchmaking isn't over yet. Heather watched wearily as she hovered overhead. One of the contents of the contract she signed, located on the back, stated that she had to do it several more times, once every 15 days. Heather was shocked indeed. She went sadly to the confessional house, and said sarcastically, "I know how, priest. I slept with a priest, and today I will also have to sneak into his room again. Can the gods forgive me?" As Heather, the enchanted voice that Arthur recognized immediately. Each of her confessions made Arthur cringe, her hands clutched to her knees, full of tension. "She's coming tonight." Arthur immediately went back to his room, took a shower, then bathed again with perfume. He was prepared to fight evil. After lying still in bed and waiting, Arthur rethought her expectations. He didn't understand why he was so excited about it. Outside the door there was a small argument from Heather with someone that Heather didn't hear. They were probably whispering that he might wake up when Heather did it. Then he would close his eyes until he caught her evil behavior. Arthur lay quietly and waited nervously. Heather opened the door slightly and entered the room. She sat on the bed next to him, reassured that with Poring's power, he was fast asleep. "I'm sorry," Heather stroked the curls of her forehead, "I don't want to attack you, but don't wake up today." She leaned down and whispered in his ear, causing Arthur to stiffen. As planned, Heather took off her nightgown again, placing her hand on his little elephant. It immediately jumped up, in the most serious way, and a few drops of sweat began to drip on Arthur's face, his face heating up.